John Murawski, recently, he wrote a piece for RealClearInvestigations about how leftist history is making it into the classroom. And the piece was titled Woke History is Making Big Inroads in America's High Schools. This is a really interesting topic because it's interestingly bothering some people on the left as well. John, thank you so much for coming on. I appreciate it.
Hey, thank you very much.
This is a powerful piece. Can you give us kind of the overview of what you feel is happening in the public schools?
So basically, most people are familiar with identity politics or political correctness or grievance studies, as the critics refer to these kinds of classes at the college level, right? They've infiltrated the universities and they're popular. People major in them, and every university has a department. But these classes are now moving down to the level of high schools and middle schools to some degree as well. And what makes them unusual is they focus, they have a very strong focus on identity politics, on oppression, on looking at people as two categories, the oppressor and the oppressed. And the oppressor will be, of course, the white male or the European or the American. And it's a kind of very kind of a neat categorization of humanity. And it creates a very neat picture of good and evil. And kids are encouraged to, they hold mock trials to hold Western civilization on trial for crimes against humanity against the Native Americans. They also are taught how to draw manifestos, to bring manifestos of demands to their school administrators. So they're kind of, recruited into social activism and community organizing. So it's a completely different model of education where instead of having the students sit passively, listen, take in information, learn a subject, they're encouraged to be very emotionally engaged and to become engaged in terms of activism, activity, and social change, which is a component of their grade and what they're learning. So, it's called ethnic studies, and it's widely established in California, and other states are adopting policies. And it's kind of spreading as a trend. And kids apparently really respond to it. They apparently seem to like these classes, or the ones who take them. Not everybody's taking them. They're the ones who do. People voluntarily major in these subjects in college. So there is a kind of a strong. It really appeals, I think, to young people, to their sense of moral outrage, their sense of having a sense of purpose, and of questioning the culture that their parents created, the world that their parents created. And underneath, those classes, there's a certain bit of extremism and I would say maybe a bit of indoctrination. But underneath, there is, the real things, the real issues about historical and some would say present issues of social inequities and injustice that they're to resolve. The question is, are they resolving them? Are they given options and alternatives in these classes, or is it more where they're spoon-fed information, which is what the critics say, is that they're basically spoon-fed kind of formulaic political slogans and recruited into radical social action. And I'm not making up the term radical. They actually themselves use the term radical often in what they're doing. It's a radical critique of capitalism, and a radical critique of whiteness, radical critique of empire. And those are the terms that they use. So it's basically that's kind of the overview of what the story's about.
I'm really struck by the fact that this is almost the mirror image of what used to happen, which is that immigrants would come into the country. You would assume that they had come to the country because they wanted to be in the country, that something had appealed to them about it. And they were then taught how to be members of the country, how to participate in the country. They were taught civics. This is kind of the opposite, is that on the one hand, we're supposed to be delighted that people of other colors and people of other cultures are coming into the West. But then at the same time, we're supposed to teach them that it's awful here, and it really is a bad thing. This place that they want to be in exists. There's some kind of underlying illogic to it, isn't there?
Well, you bring up an interesting point. One of the issues of ethnic studies is that it tends to be very one-sided. So the West is presented almost as a criminal enterprise, and native cultures tend to be, there's almost kind of a boosterism for these cultures. However, you have to remember that 100 years ago, a century ago, there were all sorts of anarchist movements, socialist movements, communist movements, and they were largely driven by ethnic groups. So there's a lot of parallels, and there's kind of almost like a repetitive cycle of ethnic groups coming in and then struggling to fit in, feeling a sense of rejection, reacting with verbal, rhetorical violence, and sometimes even kind of an Antifa-like, protest culture. I don't think this is the first time we're seeing this. I think we saw the very, very similar things about 100 years ago in this country in the 20s and the teens. And I think when it stopped is when Alexander Solzhenitsyn went to Gulag Archipelago in the cancer ward, and it just became obvious that the Soviet Union was the real criminal enterprise, and so it kind of dampened the enthusiasm among progressives for that kind of social reform.
Is it a change of pace, though, to have the public schools run by governments essentially, basically teaching anti-Western propaganda? Isn't that a little different than the 20s and 30s?
See, I don't know what schools taught 100 years ago. I don't know. I assume there were radical activist teachers. There were unionizers. There was a lot of, America has a long history of radical activity. It's not something really new. We shouldn't think of it as new. We should think of it as just something that's part of the system. We're always dealing with it and negotiating. Just like there's always been a very strong conservative and far right wing. This, it's just part of living in a very large, complex, multifaceted culture.
Is this a problem? Recently, there was a kind of controversial article in The Atlantic, and I'm sorry the name of the author has slipped my mind, but basically he said that he, a liberal, a left-winger, was giving up on public schools because his kids weren't being taught the rudiments of civics, basically. They weren't being taught how the government worked. They weren't being taught the things that are useful. If you want to get ahead and be an elite person in the country, you really have to know how the country works. So isn't there a danger here that what will happen is in the same way the elites kind of sold us sexual liberation, but they live in steady marriages and have kids in wedlock, in the same way that they're sort of teaching the poor this radicalization, but they're going to want their kids to know how the society works and how to be a thriving member of it, or are they not?
So I think the author you're talking about in The Atlantic was George Packer when he wrote about
that's correct.
Yeah, he was sending the sort of the political correctness he was experiencing there. So my sense is that these movements appeal to the elites. It's the elites who are, where is it happening at universities? It's at elite universities. It's not happening at community colleges or vocational schools. The more elite the university, the more the quotient for social justice. Why that is, I don't know. But people who tend to lead radical revolutions, from Pol Pot to others, tend to come from the upper layers of society. They tend to claim that they represent the interests of the oppressed. Now, whether that's true, I don't know. Most of the people who are oppressed have never read them and are vaguely familiar with their academic tracts and tractates. So I think it tends to be a very upper class, elite, intellectual phenomenon. It's a kind of a paradox, but that's just the way it seems to be.
Do you think this is a dangerous phenomenon, that this is now going down, this kind of radicalization is now going down to the level of high school students? Do you think it's dangerous to the polity, dangerous to the future of democratic governance? And if so, how do you think we should respond?
I don't know how to answer that question. I think, a complicated society like ours is not going to have a uniform perspective. There's going to be a lot of conflicting and clashing perspectives on reality. So that in itself is democracy in action and pluralism. I think where it gets, potentially dangerous is when you have situations like Evergreen College, where they call the cops in to escort the professors off campus. Yeah. And where you have basically kids like at Oberlin who basically roll up in fetal position because they feel that they're microaggressed to death. And, then they're actually having a hard time, interacting with other people and solving real problems. So, yeah, it could become dangerous. And it could become dangerous if the country becomes so divided that it leads to, like the writer Andrew Sullivan has compared some of the rhetoric on the left to the rhetoric that preceded the genocide in Rwanda, the complete dehumanization of the other side. And I think he's talking about both sides, not just the left, I guess. So, yeah, it could. People are very nervous about the level and intensity of the rhetoric and the one-sidedness of it. And these kinds of classes tend to kind of animate people's moral outrage in the sense that they're being wronged and they've been ripped off and they need to get stuff back. Somebody took their job and somebody took their opportunity. And so, it seems to be taking an extreme form. Yeah, it could lead to unhealthy results. But again, I don't think it's inherently dangerous in all forms, as long as, you can have reasonable professors who introduce you to this material, that challenge you, and then introduce you to alternative viewpoints.
Of course.
But, so, if you were teaching this stuff, I don't think necessarily it would be the same as some completely radicalized professor. But I think, some of these universities, they've taken the activist route, and it seems to be out of whack and out of balance. I don't think it has to be that way. I just think it has played out that way in some places. I don't know what is happening in the classrooms. I read the course descriptions in California, dozens and dozens of courses, over 800 pages of course descriptions. And if they're doing what their course descriptions say, they are sort of training these kids to lead the next revolution. I mean, the rhetoric that is somewhat inflammatory. But, these kids are taking other classes. They probably are taking an economics class and a math class, and that's not all they take. It's not there must be some balance to what they're learning.
Yeah, and maybe they'll also notice that their electricity keeps going off and their house is on fire, which doesn't speak well for the government.
They're blaming capitalism for that. They're blaming the evils of capitalism.
I've heard. John Murawski, thank you very much for coming on. The article in Real Clear Investigations is called "Woke History is Making Big Inroads in America's High Schools." It's really fascinating. It's a good investigation. Thank you for talking. I hope you come back and talk again.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
Thanks a lot.